The city had stopped breathing. Berlin, May 1945. Air thick with dust, silence heavy enough to hurt the ears. Burn! Doubt tanks lined the streets like skeletons, their tracks sunk into ash. Soviet boots crunched over broken glass, echoing between walls, still trembling from the last artillery strike. The war was over, but for the women dragged from basements and shattered apartments, surrender hadn't meant safety. Orders came quietly, through translators with tired faces. Bring them in. Through the smoke, columns of German women nurses, clerks, civilians in torn Red Cross armbands were herded toward a makeshift compound near Alexanderplatz. Their faces were blank, jaws clenched in exhaustion and terror. Behind them, soldiers spoke in clipped Russian, neither shouting nor jeering. Just efficiency. In one corner, a Soviet officer checked lists printed on cracked paper, thousands of names, all marked civilian detainee. Reports later estimated more than one. 5 million German women were detained across the Soviet zone in those first weeks. Chaos reigned, no infrastructure, no clear directives, just ruins and hunger. Many expected brutality. Propaganda had painted the Soviets as animals, but when they finally faced them, what followed didn't fit the story. One woman, Anna, remembered it years later. They said, "Get on your knees." I thought that was the end. The guards' expressions were unreadable, their rifles slung low. Dust swirled around their boots as the order echoed again. Some women started to cry, others froze. The words carried weight from nightmares, but the tone quiet, almost hesitant, felt off. Anna looked up. The nearest guard avoided her eyes. His uniform was smeared with mud and blood. He muttered something under his breath, stepped closer, and reached for her arm not roughly, but steady, like he was about to inspect something. She didn't understand, none of them did. A Soviet interpreter raised his hand, repeating the phrase, "Knock Holney," "On your knees." The women obeyed, trembling, waiting for what seemed inevitable. But as the guards knelt too, removing their gloves, examining frostbite, checking shoes, the confusion deepened into disbelief. The war was over. Yet mercy was the one weapon no one expected to see on this street. And when the guards finally spoke again, it wasn't punishment they announced. It was the beginning of something stranger. "Get on your knees." The words sliced through the cold air like a verdict. Every woman froze, their minds filled with every horror story they'd heard. Soviet boots approached, measured, heavy, and the women braced for humiliation. A few whispered prayers. Anna shut her eyes, but the expected strike never came. Instead, there was silence, then the sound of fabric tearing. She dared to look. One guard was crouched beside her, his rifle slung across his back, his hands bare. He wasn't attacking her, he was removing her boot. At first, she thought it was mockery, some new cruelty. But then she saw him pull out a small medical pouch. He pressed her ankle, inspecting it for wounds. Around her, other women gasped as soldiers began checking their feet, one by one. In the bitter Berlin spring, temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and nearly 60% of captured women had untreated frostbite, open cuts, or infections. Soviet field medics, some barely out of their teens, had been ordered to prevent disease outbreaks among all detainees, even enemy civilians. It wasn't compassion they were trained for, it was containment, yet the act felt deeply human. Anna winced as the soldier dabbed iodine on her heel. He didn't meet her eyes, didn't speak. She noticed his trembling hands, more exhaustion than aggression. Another woman whispered, "He's helping." The disbelief passed like a spark down the line. They'd been taught to see these men as beasts. But here they were, crouched in the mud, bandaging the very people they'd been told to hate. One medic, according to Soviet reports, refused his evening ration until every woman had been treated. Another burned his spare socks so the women could share the warmth from the ashes. These weren't gestures of kindness. They were fragments of conscience, breaking through orders and fatigue. Anna's guard stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. He finally looked at her, not as victor and captive, but as two humans stranded in the same wreckage. Then he turned away, muttering a single phrase, "No more war." The women didn't know whether to thank him or run. But as dusk fell, they saw something that would shake their certainty even more. Bread passed hand to hand under the dim factory lights. The hunger was its own battlefield. By evening, the women's stomachs groaned louder than their fear. They'd eaten nothing for 2 days. Berlin's food stores had collapsed with its regime. Then, under the cracked factory ceiling, came the whisper of movement. Boots scuffed, a shadow passed between the rows of women. Something hit the ground with a dull thud. A crust of bread, then another. The Soviet guards were moving quietly, pretending not to look. Each one left a piece near the captives, hard, stale rations from their own packs. Anna watched one soldier tear his portion in half, place it beside a sleeping nurse, and walk away without a word. According to Soviet supply records, each frontline soldier received 600 grams of bread per day, barely enough to sustain their own fatigue-ridden bodies. Sharing it was strictly forbidden, yet hundreds did it anyway. Hunger was the one truth they all understood. When Anna lifted the piece to her mouth, her throat locked. She couldn't swallow, not from disgust, but disbelief. The bread smelled faintly of tobacco and diesel. Across from her, a younger girl whispered, "They feed us like equals." The phrase sounded absurd in the rubble of the Third Reich. The guards said nothing. They just kept walking, leaving silent trails of generosity across the dark floor. One man stopped near the door, lit a cigarette, and looked back for a moment. The glow illuminated his face, tired, human, no trace of hatred. Then he turned, stepping out into the cold night air. Anna chewed slowly, her jaw aching. She thought of the Nazi officials who'd promised honor until death, who'd vanished the moment the city fell. Those same men had starved civilians for years, rationing food by party rank. And now it was the enemy feeding them. Our own officers never shared food. These men did. The line would appear later in a prisoner's diary, found decades afterward in a Dresden archive. The women slept that night with crumbs in their palms, afraid to waste them. Outside, the guards huddled near burning debris, shivering. Tomorrow would bring inspection, orders, new fears. But for one night, bread had replaced bullets. And as the cold crept back in, the next shock came quietly, when the guards refused shelter and built one for the women instead. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees C, sharp enough to cut through thin wool coats and bare feet. The women, huddled together on the concrete floor, wrapped in rags and silence. Every cough echoed like glass breaking. Outside, the wind howled through hollow windows, carrying the smell of burned rubber and smoke. Then came the scraping of boots again. The guards had returned, but not with rifles raised. They were dragging heavy sheets of tarpaulin, scavenged from wrecked trucks and tents. Without a word, they began hanging them along the skeletal walls, hammering nails into cracked concrete to block the wind. The sound, thud, 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 was the rhythm of a strange mercy. Anna watched as one soldier wrestled with a tarp corner that kept slipping loose. His fingers were bleeding, but he cursed only once, then smiled faintly when it held. The women didn't know whether to thank him or stay silent. Gratitude felt dangerous. Field records from spring 1945 describe mass hypothermia among detainees in makeshift shelters. Temperatures at night fell below 10 degrees C, and without insulation, exposure killed faster than hunger. Yet here, in this forgotten warehouse, the captors were improvising warmth for the captured. When they finished, the guards stepped back, inspecting their work. One tossed a blanket thin and patched. To Anna's group, "For you," he muttered in broken German. His breath came out in fog. The women looked at each other, confused, then noticed something. The men weren't keeping any for themselves. Outside, soldiers rolled up in their coats and lay on bare ground. Inside, the women sat under tarps that flapped gently in the wind. The contradiction was unbearable kindness from the enemy, indifference from the past they'd served. One woman whispered, "They gave us blankets they didn't have." Another added, "And they didn't ask why." It wasn't charity, it was fatigue meeting decency halfway. War had stripped these men of ideology. What remained was something raw, instinctive, a shared will to survive the cold without losing what little was left of their humanity. Anna couldn't sleep. Through the thin fabric, she saw the guard who'd built the shelter still awake, staring into the dark. When dawn came, she heard truck engines outside and boots in formation. An officer was arriving, with orders that would change everything again. Dawn cracked through the tarps like a knife of pale light. The sound of engines echoed across the ruined streets, trucks grinding over rubble, gears protesting in the cold. Inside the warehouse, conversation died instantly. A Soviet officer had arrived. Tall, angular face, cap perfectly straight, clipboard in hand. His silence carried more authority than any shout. He stepped through the doorway, scanning the women like a surgeon preparing for a difficult operation. The guard stiffened. This was Lieutenant Mikhail Orlov, part of the new administrative corps sent to stabilize detainee management. His uniform was clean. Too clean for Berlin. He motioned to an interpreter, then began reading names from a wrinkled document lists pulled from captured Nazi archives, part of the 300 tons of records seized by the Soviets in Berlin alone. The women froze as their identities were spoken aloud. Names, birthplaces, even employment details. For the first time, the prisoners realized these men knew everything. When Orlov called Anna Keller, nurse, Charité Hospital, her breath caught. He didn't look up, just ticked a box like a bureaucrat at the edge of history, but his eyes lingered on the next name, Elizabeth Weber, translator, propaganda ministry. The pause was long. The silence that followed was unbearable. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. The guards glanced at her, uncertain if punishment was coming. But Orlov didn't shout. He simply raised his hand, gesturing for her to step forward. Then, to everyone's confusion, he set the clipboard down and removed his gloves. Instead of interrogation, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small stack of blank forms Red Cross stationery. He placed one on a crate, slid a pencil across it, and said quietly through the interpreter, "Write home." Gasps rippled through the women. Letters in this chaos, the idea felt absurd. Yet Orlov simply waited, face expressionless. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was procedure. The Soviet Bureau of Prisoners had begun registering POW correspondence for repatriation. But to those women, it was hope wearing a soldier's face. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she took the pencil. Around her, others began to write, the scratching of graphite mixing with the distant rumble of tanks outside. But she hesitated. Her secret, a Nazi party pin hidden under her dress seam, was burning against her skin. And she knew if they found it, no letter would ever reach home. The smell of pencil lead mixed with dust and damp fabric. One by one, the women bent over crates and scrap wood, writing the first words they dared to hope again, "I'm alive." The Soviet officer, Lieutenant Orlov, walked between them, clipboard under his arm, nodding silently. His boots clicked softly on the concrete floor. Outside, distant engines coughed to life. The city was still waking. Elizabeth sat frozen over her page. Her hand hovered, but her mind was blank. What do you write to a family that believed you served in an office while the right crumbled around you? Her hidden Nazi party pin pressed cold against her skin. The irony bit deep. Here she was, writing home under the protection of the men her leaders had called subhuman. Orlov stopped beside her, lowering himself slightly to eye level. "Right," he said through the interpreter. "Your family will get it." His tone wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either, just mechanical, weary. Across the room, a medic helped a young woman spell out her street name in Cyrillic letters. "He helped me spell my own street right," that woman later wrote. Soviet field reports confirm, by July 1945, over 40 0 POW letters were processed through the Red Cross in the Soviet zone. Anna finished her note short, plain, trembling, and handed it over. The guard took it carefully, as if afraid the paper might tear. It was a strange ritual, Enemies turned couriers of human connection. Elizabeth still hadn't written a word. Her pencil broke mid-thought. The officer noticed, wordlessly replaced it. But she couldn't begin, not while the pin was still hidden. In that small act of concealment, she felt chained to the regime that had already vanished. When Orlov gathered the letters, he stacked them neatly, tying them with thread scavenged from a torn uniform sleeve. "Tomorrow, another batch," he murmured. "All who wish, write again." As he left, Elizabeth's gaze followed him to the doorway. His posture wasn't that of a victor. It was a man shouldering ghosts not his own. But as the door shut and the sound of trucks faded, she made her choice. That night, she reached under her dress seam and pulled the party pin free, just as a guard's flashlight swept across her. The beam of the flashlight froze her. Elizabeth's fingers clenched around the small metal pin, the tiny swastika glinting in the dim light like a confession. The guard stood just a few feet away, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. For one breathless second, neither moved. Then he stepped forward. The sound of his boots echoed on the cracked concrete. Elizabeth's pulse pounded in her ears. If he reported her, she'd be marked as a party loyalist, no protection, no letters, no repatriation. Death didn't always come from bullets. Sometimes it came quietly, through orders signed in ink. He stopped in front of her. The pin lay exposed in her trembling hand. He looked at it, then at her face. His expression didn't harden, it softened. The flashlight lowered, Nazi. He asked in broken German. She nodded once, unable to speak. He didn't shout. Instead, he took the pin gently, studied it under the flickering light, and slipped it into his pocket. His voice dropped to a whisper, "Not now." Then he turned and walked away. In that moment, Elizabeth didn't know if she'd been spared or marked. The next morning, she saw him again, standing by the door as if nothing had happened, face unreadable. According to Soviet debriefing records, minor offenders, those tied to low-level party work, were often overlooked. The priority was officers, propagandists, and war criminals. Still, the decision lay entirely with the guard on scene. One report noted, discretion left to field personnel in cases of female detainees without confirmed ranks. Elizabeth couldn't shake the image of him slipping the pin into his pocket. Was it mercy or evidence for later? She couldn't tell. That day, while the women swept the floor and organized bedding, she kept glancing toward him. He avoided her eyes but never left the room. In his silence, she sensed exhaustion deeper than anger. He looked tired, not vengeful. She wrote years later in a post-war memoir, that fatigue shared, human, wordless, bridged the gap between captor and captive. But the next dawn, a new shock awaited her. The same man who'd pocketed her pin now stood in front of the group again, only this time, with a chalkboard and a strange announcement. Today, Russian lessons. The warehouse smelled faintly of smoke and chalk dust. At sunrise, the guard who'd once caught Elizabeth with her Nazi pin now stood before the women with a crude chalkboard balanced on 2 ammunition crates. The word KHLEB was scrawled across it in uneven Cyrillic. He tapped the board twice with a stick. KHLEB, he repeated slowly, bread. The women stared, unsure if it was a joke. Teaching, now, in a POW camp surrounded by ruins. But he wasn't smiling. Behind him, another soldier held up a slice of bread, nodding. KHLEB. They echoed, hesitant. Then came Spazabo, thank you. Their voices trembled as they tried the foreign syllables. Some pronounced it wrong, some laughed nervously, others just listened. The guard corrected them gently, drawing letters again, sounding them out. The absurdity of it. German women learning the language of their conquerors felt like a scene from a different world. Official reports confirm that by August 1945, Soviet administrators in several temporary camps began introducing basic Russian lessons to manage communication, prevent misunderstandings, and ease the burden on translators. But in this cold Berlin warehouse, it became something deeper, the first shared vocabulary between enemies. Elizabeth repeated Spazabo softly, the word sticking in her throat. The guard nodded once, eyes meeting hers for the first time since the night he'd taken her pin. For a flicker of a moment, she understood the act of learning wasn't submission. It was survival. Later, Anna laughed for the first time in weeks when another woman mispronounced good morning. So badly the guard couldn't stop smiling. Laughter spread through the rows like warmth. We were learning the language of our captors. Anna would write later, and it didn't feel like chains. The sentence would resurface decades later in an oral history archive, still trembling with the shock of that realization. Outside, the city was still coughing smoke. Inside, syllables bounced softly off the walls bred, "Thank you, friend." Tiny bridges made of sound, stretching across ruins of hate. But kindness wasn't supposed to exist here. And outside the fence, rumors were spreading fast. Soviet command had heard about the friendly camp in Berlin. Inspections were coming, and when the new orders arrived, mercy itself would go on trial. By the third week, the warehouse no longer smelled like fear. It smelled of soap, bread, and damp laundry. The women had started cleaning the place, sweeping the floor, boiling water in tin cans. The guards had stopped barking orders. Now they gave gestures instead. Life, fragile and improvised, was forming inside the rubble. Then, one grey morning, the sound of a motorbike shattered the calm. A courier jumped off, mud splattering his coat, and handed Lieutenant Orr of a sealed envelope. He read it once. Then again, slower, his jaw tightened. Inspection. The interpreter whispered. The word dropped like a grenade. Orlov looked around. The tarps, the chalkboard still covered in Russian words, the women who now looked more like civilians than prisoners. He knew what Moscow expected to see: discipline, distance, detachment. Instead, they'd built something dangerously close to normal. "Hide everything," he said sharply. The guards scrambled. The chalkboard was pulled down and buried under debris. Shared utensils vanished, letters and blankets were tucked away, even the bread portions gifts shared in secret were hidden behind crates. Soviet field regulations were strict. Fraternization with prisoners of enemy nations is punishable by demotion or confinement. In 1945 alone, over 20 Soviet officers were officially reprimanded for showing undue leniency toward POW. Everyone here knew the risk. The same guards who'd once built shelters now scrubbed the floors spotless, removing traces of kindness. One even tore down a handmade clothesline the women had strung between beams. "If they see this, they'll think we're weak," he muttered. Anna watched silently, heart pounding. It was like watching their fragile humanity being erased one gesture at a time. The man who'd taught them spasibo refused to meet their eyes. He looked ashamed not for what he'd done, but for what he was about to undo. When night fell, the camp was spotless, sterile, soulless again. Only the smell of chalk lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of their small rebellion. "They risked punishment for treating us like people," Anna whispered. No one answered. The next morning, engines roared outside, trucks, boots, and the sharp rhythm of authority. The commissars had arrived. Their expressions would decide what stayed human here, and what wouldn't survive the report. The trucks rolled to a stop, their engines cutting into a silence so sharp it hurt. Doors slammed. Heavy boots hit the ground. The commissars had come, grey overcoats, polished pistols, and eyes like steel behind wire-rimmed glasses. They didn't speak as they entered, just looked at everything. Inside, the air was suffocating. The women stood in rigid lines, hands clasped, the guards. Those same men who'd once taught them words and built tarps now stood expressionless, rifles straight, jaws locked. Every sound, the creak of boots, the rustle of papers echoed like judgment. Lieutenant Orlov saluted sharply. "Camp secured, Comrade Commissar," he said. The senior officer nodded, eyes sweeping the space. He took out a small notebook, scribbling observations. His gaze lingered on the tarps still hanging unevenly against one wall. "Who ordered this?" Orlov's throat went dry. "For wind protection, sir. Temporary measure." The commissar stepped closer, touched the fabric, and said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he looked at the women, thin, pale, still trembling, and back at Orlov. There was a long pause. The tension cracked like ice underfoot. Finally, the commissar said, efficient, one word, flat, cold, but not condemning. He moved on, inspecting the infirmary, a corner where Orlov's men had hidden a few injured captives behind stacked crates. The commissar pulled back the tarp. Inside, a young Soviet medic stood frozen beside a German woman with bandaged feet. For one unbearable second it seemed over. Then the commissar simply nodded again, muttering to his aide. Unexpected order and morale. The phrase would later appear almost verbatim in a 1945 inspection report of Berlin detention sites. When they finally left, no punishment came, just a quiet order, maintain standard, continue processing. The trucks drove off, engines fading into the ruins. For the first time in days, someone exhaled. A guard laughed under his breath. Another sat down, shaking. The women looked at them. Half relief, half disbelief. Humanity had survived inspection. They saw humanity and didn't punish it. Anna whispered, eyes wet. But survival always carried a cost. 2 days later, new orders arrived trance, a posting stamped with red seals. The guards who'd shared bread and language were being reassigned, eastward, and the women would soon learn what absence felt like. The order came before dawn. Trucks rumbled into the yard, their headlights cutting pale tunnels through the fog. The women were already awake, they could sense it. Something in the air felt different. The guards moved quietly, packing what little gear they owned. No shouts, no whistles, just silence and the sound of canvas being folded. Elizabeth stood by the fence, gripping the wire. The man who had once taught her spazabo was rolling up his blanket, face hidden under his cap. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but her throat refused. Around her, others stood motionless, watching the men who had once been their captors prepare to leave like comrades after a long campaign neither side had won. Lieutenant Orlov made the announcement in his low, even tone. This unit is being transferred east. New guards will arrive by evening. Remain orderly. Then he paused. His eyes swept the group of women faces drawn, fragile but alive. You will be processed for repatriation soon, he added. Summed within the year. That phrase within the year hung like a half-promise. Soviet records later confirmed that by late 1946, over 90% of German women POW were repatriated through Soviet, had ministered corridors. But in that moment, no one trusted numbers, only faces. One of the women, Anna, reached into her pocket and pulled out her last bread ration. As Orlov passed by, she extended it silently. He stopped, looked at the small offering and shook his head. Keep it, he murmured, you'll need it. She pressed it into his palm anyway, so will you, she whispered. He didn't take it. Instead, he saluted her. An awkward human gesture that broke every rule of distance. A few of the soldiers climbed onto the trucks. One turned back and shouted in broken German, good luck. The engine coughed, gears grinding. As they pulled away, the women followed the convoy with their eyes until the trucks were swallowed by dust and morning light. We watched them go, Elizabeth wrote later, and it felt like losing brothers. Silence settled over the camp again, an empty kind of quiet. But history wasn't finished with them yet, because decades later, in a forgotten archive, one of those letters, Elizabeth's, would resurface, still sealed, still waiting to be read. It was decades later, early 1970s, Dresden. A young historian sat surrounded by dust and silence inside an archive that smelled of mold and paper rot. The Cold War outside was loud, but in this room only whispers of the old one remained. Stamped boxes marked Soviet correspondence, Berlin Sector 1945, lined the shelves. Thousands of them. She opened one. Inside, tied with fraying twine, were dozens of unopened letters, thin, yellowed, fragile as leaves. Some ink had bled, others still clear enough to read names that history had almost erased. And there it was, one envelope among many. Elizabeth Weber. Return address, none, The historian hesitated, then slit it open. The paper inside crackled softly. The handwriting trembled, looping unevenly from exhaustion but steady in its honesty. I don't know if you'll ever see this. The guards here are not what we were told. They give us food, they don't shout, they fix what they can. One told me today, you'll go home. I didn't believe him, but maybe, just maybe, he was right. The historian sat back, stunned. This wasn't propaganda. It was raw, personal, defiant in its quietness. One of thousands of voices that had fallen through the cracks of vengeance and ideology. Researchers later estimated that over 15,000 undelivered POW letters like hers were discovered across Soviet archives, messages never sent, never censored, simply lost in bureaucracy and time. Yet each one told the same story, not of armies or nations, but of people rediscovering decency in the ruins. Outside, rain began tapping the window. The historian stared at the words, imagining that Berlin warehouse, those tarps, the chalkboard, the bread. She saw faces hungry, frightened, human, and she understood something rare. Mercy had survived the war, even if memory hadn't. Elizabeth's letter was carefully placed back into its envelope, now labeled repatriated for record, 1973. It was never delivered to her family. They were gone by then. But her words lived on, traveling further than any soldier, further than any flag. Wars end, occupations fade. But sometimes, the truest front line isn't in gunfire or orders, it's in the quiet moment, when one human chooses not to hate another.